A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrero.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been dedicated by Ari Miller in honor of Rabbi Jonathan Bienenfeld. And this episode is going to be about a very interesting and I believe apropos topic, a bit contemporary, a little bit different style than what we usually do here on Jewish History Soundbites, and it is the recent phenomena that we are phenomena, whatever it is, that we are witness to in the Chassidic and beyond world of Mashpi'im. I guess we can call them influencers or teachers or inspirers that attract quite a following. And how do we see that in the context of Jewish history, especially in regarding the history of the Chassidic movement? Before I get to that, though, we just had an episode last week about divorce in Jewish history, recent Jewish history, and there was a correction submitted by, 5 to 10 people, very astute listeners of Jewish History Soundbites, and I erred in my recounting a story regarding the Chassam Sofer and Rabbi Eliezer Landau, the rabbi in Brody. And apparently I had said that, incorrectly said that the Chassam Sofer was protesting this idea of writing a get on Shabbos, where apparently it was, God forbid, that anyone would have any intention of writing a get on Shabbos. It actually is about this holiday that we just experienced. It was about the second day of Shavuos, and writing a get on the second day of Shavuos under extenuating circumstances. And of course, the Chassam Sofer was protesting that vehemently as well. In other words, he was completely against that idea as well. But this Rabbi Eliezer Landau, who had thought of the idea, he wasn't proposing, God forbid, to write a get on Shabbos. He was proposing to write one on the second day of Shavuos. Okay, let's get back to today's topic, and it's in honor of this Shavuos that we just had. Shavuos, of course, is the yahrzeit of the Baal Shem Tov, and the one who is seen as the father of the Chassidic movement. And I want to speak about the current trend of Mashpi'im in the Chassidic world and beyond. It's not limited to the Chassidic world. I'm not sure, I'm trying to figure out, the last several days, what the English translation of Mashpi'im would be. Are we going to call them influencers? If it was 10, 15 years ago, then I would be very comfortable referring to them as influencers. The problem today is that it has this connotation of social media, which I believe would be not doing justice to these great people who are mashpi'im in the Chassidic world. So maybe we'll call them people who inspire or teach Chassidic teachings to diverse crowds, something along those lines. I don't know if there's one word in English that can encapsulate what a Chassidic mashpia is, but we definitely see them today. People like Rav Meilech Biederman or Rabbi Meyer Morgenstern, or remember a few years ago it was more popular, Reb Tzvi Meyer Zilberberg, or Rav Remel Shor, or you have in Breslov people like Ramata Frank, and there's tens and tens of examples, and people who are like that, great people, wonderful people, and I definitely usually do not talk about anything contemporary. And I don't want to talk about anything contemporary, and therefore this is a very different type of an episode. By the way, I chose the topic, so it was not, I can't really even blame anyone, but we usually explore on Jewish History Soundbites, we try to shy away from things that are contemporary. But here, it seemingly this Mashpi'im phenomena would be in the realm of sociology and not history. So why am I doing it? And I'll tell you why. The last several months, maybe more, several listeners have reached out to me regarding this topic, asking if there's a historical precedent or antecedent or a perspective that can be given to this curious phenomenon, which somewhat breaks conventions within the Chassidic movement and to a certain extent has extended to the Orthodox world beyond the confines of the insular Chassidic communities and has an impact on the yeshiva community in both Israel and the United States, as well as the modern Orthodox community in the United States, as well as the Dati Leumi national religious community in Israel. So this whole idea of these Chassidic Mashpi'im and the influence, it's outside the established norms of the Chassidic court, of Chassidic dynasties, these people who kind of like crop up from a grassroots up and have this grassroots influence without a formal institutionalized court or dynasty or political organization behind them. They're just people who are inspiring others in Chassidic teachings, teaching others, and people gravitate to them from across the Orthodox spectrum. And a lot of people were very curious about this. How do we see this in historical context, especially in the context of the Chassidic movement? And the answer is yes, there is what to say about it historically. The current day Mashpi'im phenomena is a recurring theme in the history of the Chassidic movement, going back to the Baal Shem Tov himself, and has appeared in different forms and in different expressions throughout the nearly 300-year history of the movement. So that's what I want to go into, and that's not going to really speak about the contemporary idea of it and how it works. I'm just going to try to relate it and how I see it through the history. So, what do these Mashpi'im offer? Who are they, and who is their intended audience, and what is their place in the current Chassidic movement, and how can we view them in historical context? So, for one thing, in two old and established dynasties, Breslov and Chabad, there were always Mashpi'im. In Breslov, it was more understandable because since the Rebbe had passed on in 1810, Reb Nachman of Breslov, and didn't really have a real replacement as a unifying force of the tzaddik of the entire movement, what really cropped up was the idea that there's different prominent mashpi'im within it, and that is a trend that continues in Breslov till today. And there's a lot to say about Breslov in that regard, especially since Breslov is part of the story today, because it's Breslov Mashpi'im who are influencing and having an impact and teaching beyond the Breslov community, both within the Chassidic movement and even beyond the Chassidic movement itself. In other words, people who don't regularly identify as Chassidic, but will have a connection to the Torah of a popular Breslov Mashpia, and that will be his connection to Chassidic thought and teachings and Torah. In Chabad, you have a similar concept, which is worth exploring on its own merit, but this existed all throughout the history of Chabad. Mashpi'im, local Mashpi'im in each town or in each major Chabad center across the Pale of Settlement, in places that were quite distant from Lubavitch, from headquarters, we'll call it, and there were these Mashpi'im that always, and they were even called Mashpi'im. I even had an episode recently about Remendel Futterfass, who was a mashpia in Chabad in the Soviet Union under very challenging circumstances. And there's literally hundreds of Chabad mashpiim. Some of them were quite famous and prominent and are worthy of discussion in their own merit. So there you have, in two Chassidic dynasties, you always had this phenomenon. Just what we're seeing today is that it's way beyond just Breslov and Chabad, with a much greater intended audience. And I want to talk about today, again, before I get into more of the history, the hypothetical or perhaps real people who are the ones who are gravitating to these influencers, to these teachers of Hasidus. They are the consumers of the Mashpi'im's product, if we want to frame it in economic terms. The Mashpi'im are offering a product, and there are people who consume it. So who are these consumers? So let's say, theoretically, in a very abstract, hypothetical sense, we have a Babov or Vizhnitz Chassid residing in Yerushalayim or Bnei Brak, and let's say he's a proud Vizhnitz Chassid, a follower of the Vizhnitz Rebbe, whomever he may be. You've got quite a few to choose from today. And our hypothetical Yankel, we'll call him, sends his children to Vizhnitz schools, davens in a Vizhnitz shtibel with a Vizhnitz nusach, and follows Vizhnitz customs, donates funds to Vizhnitz institutions, and since everything in Israel is measured in political terms, he identifies with and votes for causes which are promoted by the Vizhnitz political activists, and possibly even by the Vizhnitzer Rebbe himself. Yet, as a Chassid, and as someone who identifies as a Chassid, he seeks to grow in Chasidus, in the unique service of God that was taught by the Baal Shem Tov down through the centuries, in ways that were, that he wants to grow and follow those teachings and be inspired to follow those teachings. So in his spare time, he attends the weekly talk of someone like Reb Meilich Biderman or something like that, or someone like that. And that doesn't in any way negate his Vizhnitz identity. It's merely the address where he gets his Chasidus, his teachings of Chasidus. See, here we have a very interesting situation. His dress, his education, his customs, his politics, his institutions, etc. In other words, all of his communal or cultural identity is Vizhnitz. That's where it is. Whereas his connection to the mashpia and the message that this mashpia carries and the impact that this mashpia has on him, we can refer to as his Chassidic identity or his service of God identity, his Avodas Hashem. If we want to oversimplify things and definitely annoy some people by oversimplifying it and framing it in those terms. So, are there objective criteria to be classified as a mashpia? Again, in 2023. As far as I know, there aren't any. I haven't found anyone who made a very formal classification of what a mashpia is. So, I made up my own. I made up 4 criteria, what I would refer to as a mashpia, and this is all to better understand it in historical context. Number 1, in order to be considered a mashpia according to the rules of Yehudi Geberer, you have to not have a dynasty. In other words, past and future. For the time being, as we'll see, it's very likely that in the future there will be a dynasty, a new dynasty. But right now, it's completely a grassroots phenomenon. The person doesn't come from anyone. In the formal sense, he might have some yichus, but that's not what makes him a mashpia. Right now he stands on his own merits. That's criteria number 1. Criteria number 2, he does not have institutions or a court or a formal chutzner that a Chassidic Rebbe or Tzaddik normally has. No formal institutions or a formal court. The question is, if a shtibel is included in institutions, that's a good question. I'm willing to let a shtibel go. He's allowed to have a shtibel and still be called a mashpia. Number 3, the main attraction, the main thing about him, his main claim to fame, is that he teaches Hasidus in its most basic and simple form. That's number 3. And criteria number 4, perhaps the most important of the 4, is that the consumers, or the people who gravitate to him, the ones who he talks to, the ones who are attracted to him, are diverse and not limited to a specific community within or even outside of the Chassidic movement. That's a very important criteria. And there's and now I want to go in more into the history. And because what I see is I see there's a very big similarity between today's Mashpi'im and the Baal Shem Tov himself. Or, excuse me, or the Baal Shem Tov's early students, early followers, or even several students of the Maggid of Mezrich, obviously, Reb Dover, the Maggid of Mezrich, the primary successor of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov himself was someone who basically taught Chassidus. The Baal Shem Tov did not found a movement and never oversaw a movement. It grew into a movement in the last years of the Maggid of Mezrich's life, in the late 1760s and the early 1770s, and then even more so after the Maggid's passing. But for sure, the Baal Shem Tov, who passed away on Shavuos in 1760, he never saw any Chassidic movement. So what was he doing? He had this small chabura of students who came to visit him, or he actually traveled around and visited them, and he taught Chassidus. He taught a message. He had a message in Avodas Hashem, in Torah, in the secrets of Torah, in the mystical part of Torah also, and he inspired others, and he had a strong and impactful message, and people were attracted to it and very excited about it, and they began to follow his teachings. And he didn't have institutions, the Baal Shem Tov. He didn't have a formal court. He did not have. He also didn't have a Chassidic dress. If you want to get into that, I think we spoke about that once. He also didn't follow most of the Chassidic customs of today. So he was just teaching Chassidus. That's what it was all about. And that's exactly what many of these Mashpi'im are doing. Now, it's not only the Baal Shem Tov, it's also many students of his and students of the Maggid. Not all. Some of them did establish formal courts, but some of them were just Mashpi'im. Some of the Baal Shem Tov, Rav Pinchas of Koretz, as far as I know, did not have a formal court. He was probably just a mashpia. Who else of the Baal Shem Tov? There are other examples of it. More of the Maggid, I would think, or Moshe Leib of Sasov was definitely, I would refer to him as a mashpia. Reb Leib Saras, the same thing. To a certain extent, even the Kedushas Levi, Reb Levi Yitzchak of Barditchevo, he was the rabbi of several different towns, but he never had a formal Chassidic court. He never had any institutions. He never had that in the normal understanding of what a Rebbe is. Like some of his colleagues, such as the Naim Elimelech, or Melech of Lezhensk, or the Baal HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe, they had formal courts. I don't think the Kedushas Levi, the Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev did, as far as my understanding is. Or even Reb Shmuel Shmelk of Nikolsburg, who was also rabbi of several towns, but he was a mashpia as far as his Chassidic tzaddik personality was. I don't think he was a formal Rebbe, in the formal sense, what we recognize as a Rebbe and as a tzaddik and a Chassidic leader. So I would say that many of the early, and there's definitely several other examples, and I'm sure our listeners will fill me in on who I forgot and who I should have said, and there's a lot to discuss about it. But many of these early people, the Baal Shem Tov himself, several of his students, several students of the Maggid, in the early generations of the Chassidic movement, there is this idea that they're Mashpi'im. And that's the nature of the movement, because it's a spiritual revivalist movement. And there's a new message in the spiritual sense. It becomes a social communal movement only in the next phase. But in the early phase, it's just a spiritual message. That's all there is to it. So there's the Chassidic movement was. That's what it was. It was. In addition to that, it also became later on a social and communal framework as well. Later on, it was institutionalized even more. Once the courts became more established, once there was dynastic succession, once there was a wider geographic influence, once there's wealth increase in the court, and you can have things that are much more formal, much more organized. Once many tzaddikim and their dynasties had political influence with the government, and therefore they become much more established, and it becomes less of the mashpia type of Chassidic tzaddik, and it becomes much more formal, much more what we recognize today. Now therein lay the challenge. If it starts off as a spiritual renewal movement, it goes through phases. There's this initial excitement and something new, something fresh. There's a new way to serve Hashem. It's very exciting. But as it becomes a mass movement, it overtakes kehillas. It overtakes communal infrastructure. The next generation of children are born into it. So it risks losing its vitality. And that's exactly what happened to the Chassidic movement. So what would be the solution? So when one takes a step back and views the movement's growth and success over nearly 3 centuries, one can't help but be incredibly impressed how well it's lasted, how well it's grown and flourished under new conditions, facing challenges of modernity, facing the destruction of the Holocaust, and ultimately rebuilding completely in new geographical locations, which were very different than where it had been born and flourished in its early centuries of Eastern Europe. So what I see when I take the macro long view of the Chassidic movement, what I see is that the secret to its long-term success is the fact that it's able to reinvent itself from time to time. It's able to adapt new spiritual messages whenever it became too institutionalized. It's able to have these grassroots people and leaders, new ones, rise up from time to time and give it new vitality and give it a new message, and therefore it is able to preserve and renew its vitality whenever necessary. And I think that is a tribute to the success of Hasidus, and it's incredible to see how almost like every half a century or so, maybe a drop more, every 70, 80 years, you actually see this cyclical movement now of renewal within the Chassidic movement. I think it's wild. It's an incredible story to be told, which I'm going to touch on parts of it now, because the reason I agreed to do something contemporary about Mashpi'im in 2023 on this podcast is because I really see it as another stage in what has always been from every 70, 80 years in the Chassidic movement. I see it throughout its 300-year history, and I see this is just the next one, and therefore it's exciting to see that it kind of like verifies what has been a theory in understanding the history of the Chassidic movement. You almost kind of like see history in front of your eyes. You see it happening again. In general, it's important to view history as cyclical. History moves in cycles, maybe like a spiral. But we very often make the mistake of seeing history as progressive, as a linear progressive line. It's not. It very much goes in cycles, and there's lots to say about that in general, both in general world history and in specific histories of different ethnic groups or societies or peoples. It definitely works in cycles, maybe like a spiral, so it's a bit of both. It's also progressive, but it's also a cycle, and therefore you see when we because, again, thinking in economic terms, the downs in the market are not always something to be too concerned about, because it's expected, it's built into the system, it's supposed to be. You recover from it much stronger and better than before, and that's how history works everywhere. And the Chassidic movement is no exception to that. So in the Chassidic movement, after this first stage of the 1700s, when the Baal Shem Tov, his students, the Maggid students, these Mashpi'im, who have this new spiritual message, and it emerges as a mass movement in the early 1800s. And now, for the first time, it's not just Mashpi'im, it's real, institutionalized, it's real established courts, and the leaders, the Chassidic leaders at the time, identified this as the first crisis of the Chassidic movement. We see it in their writings, it comes down in the stories that we heard about this time. Because now that it became a mass movement, now that it became institutionalized, so now there's the danger that it's going to lose its vitality, its excitement, its message, its spiritual message. So there's various different responses. In fact, it's cited from one of the greatest tzaddikim of that era in the early decades of the 19th century, the Arla Shamayim, Reb Meir of Apta. He paraphrased the pasuk in the Torah. He said, Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'yiso. The job of the Chassidic tzaddik is to continue speaking to the Bnei Yisrael, to continue speaking to the Jewish people. You just keep teaching Hasidus, and if it became too big and too institutionalized and too formal, then some people will still gain, some people won't, but the job of the tzaddik is to continue business as usual. There were others who differed. Reb Naftali of Rapshitz, the Rapshitzer, Reb Tzvi Elimelech Shapiro of Dinov, the Bnei Yissaschar, and others. They recast the Chassidic movement into its formal infrastructure. They said, let's take it as is. Now that we've overtaken most Jewish communities in Galicia, in that area, the heart of the Chassidic world in the early 1800s is already Galicia at this point. And they said, okay, so now we're the rabbis of the towns. Now we took over the communities. We're not an outside fringe movement anymore. We're a mass movement that has completely overtaken this area of Galicia and these principal areas. So now let's try to bring the Chassidic movement into the daily life, and especially so that they saw the challenges of modernity. Now we said, now we're going to use the tools of Chassidus, the tools of the Chassidic movement, to confront the challenges of modernity, to confront emancipation, technological advances, economic changes, the secular beginnings of secularization, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. Chassidus was not created to confront those challenges because the Chassidic movement preceded the challenges of modernity by at least a half a century, if not more. But these great Chassidic leaders said, now that we have it, the Chassidic movement has a bunch of tools, and these tools will give us, and that's the vitality. That's the renewal. That's the spiritual renewal, because now we're this combative, on the defense tradition, and we're using Chassidus to combat these and confront the challenges of modernity. And that's the first Mashpi'im sort of thing. It's not really Mashpi'im in the sense that we recognize it today, but what it is saying that we can confront the challenges of modernity using the tools of Chassidus, and that is going to save Chassidus too. In essence, we can say that the challenges of modernity saved Chassidus because now they incorporated into the Chassidic identity that Chassidus is this defense, this mounting this strong defense against the challenges of modernity. Another response at the time was spiritual renewal within the Chassidic movement, kind of like a second revolution, which I don't mean in the dispute between Stalin and Trotsky, which I'm not going to get into at this point. I'm talking about within the Chassidic movement, there's this second spiritual renewal. Think Pshischa, and what Pshischa brought, especially in its extreme factions like Kotsk. It was this second renewal within the Chassidic movement. A new message, a new spiritual message, a new vitality, a new excitement. Polish Hasidus is built on that premise until Polish Hasidus becomes institutionalized. Or, if we go to the fringes of the Chassidic movement, that's Reb Nachman of Breslov. That's exactly his response. Chabad, to a certain extent, also in another way, which I'm not going to get into. We're short on time here. So that's the responses at the beginning of the 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, there's the second crisis of the Chassidic movement, and this is the great crisis. This threatened to make the Chassidic movement extinct, and I discussed this in its own episode, the great crisis of the Chassidic movement. And what's the primary response in this context? Education. This becomes the Mashpi'im, the vehicle of Mashpi'im, of bringing new vitality to the Chassidic movement at the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th centuries. There's this new Chassidus through education, reaching out to the youth. Many examples of this. Probably the best one is also the first one, the establishment of the Tamchei Tamimim network of yeshivas by the Rebbe Rashab of Chabad in 1897. Tamchei Tamimim becomes the engine of renewal within the Chassidic movement, especially in the Pale of Settlement, especially in the Russian Empire, especially in Chabad Lubavitch itself, but it has an impact even beyond. And I believe, and I'm sure my Chabad listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, that the main person within, the main educational personality within the Tamchei Tamimim branches was the Mashpia. He was actually called the Mashpia. And this was a renewal. Now, but it's not only in Lubavitch. It's in Ger, that's the Masifta of Warsaw, and other yeshivas that Ger oversaw. Alexander Chassidus starts a yeshiva at this time also. You have Radomsk. The Radomsk Rebbe starts the Keser Torah network of yeshivas, which eventually has between 3,000 and 4,000 students across Poland. The Kedusha Sin of Babov starts the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva network. There's a yeshiva in Vishnitz. There's Hungarian Hasidus borrows the Chassam Sofer yeshiva model and incorporates it into Hungary and Romania. All right, the Satmarov is before he's a Hasidic leader, he's a Rosh Yeshiva and a Rav, the rabbi of the town. I think I mentioned that, and many others are like that as well. Sochatchov has yeshivas, the Avnei Nezer and his son, the Shemi Shmuel. They ran a yeshiva which was very popular. It got some of the best minds of Polish Hasidus came to study in Sochatchov. And then you have probably the best examples, Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. That's exactly what Rameir Shapiro is doing. He's taking the education, and that is the answer to Chassidus. It's going to be a Chassidic yeshiva, but it's going to be on the grand scheme. That's Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. It's going to renew Jewish life in Poland. It's going to renew Chassidus in Poland. It's going to add vitality and renewal. And how is he doing it? By reaching the youth with a new educational model, which I discussed in another episode of Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. And my favorite example of it is Piasetzna. The Piasetzna Rebbe. He almost retires from being a Rebbe. He moves out of Piasetzna because of World War I and never really goes back. He goes back for like Yom Tov, he goes back for Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, a few weeks here and there. But he basically lives in Warsaw. He transplanted to the urban environment, like many Rebbes did at the time. But he almost retires from his position as Rebbe and becomes a Rosh Yeshiva. He opens a yeshiva in Warsaw, Das Moshe, and his goal is to reach the youth. He has an entire educational philosophy which was very modern, very progressive, and it's expressed in his books like Chayvus HaTalmidim, and he reaches out to the youth. And that's an incredible story of, and in that context, he's a mashpia. The Piasetzna Rebbe of Kleinu Miskalma Shapiro is a mashpia, as were many of these other ones in these Radomsky yeshivas or other places. I remember interviewing an elderly woman who she grew up in the town of Oshpitzin, Oshvemshim, where the Nazis built right nearby Auschwitz. And she was from a Babaver Chassidic family, and she told me that 3 of her brothers converted from Babov to Radomsk. They became Radomsker Hasidim. Why? Because there was a local Keser Torah branch yeshiva in the town, in Oshpitzin, and they all attended that yeshiva, and they got swept away by the charisma of the Mashpia, or Rosh Yeshiva, whatever he was called, in the local Keser Torah branch, and they became Radomsker Hasidim. By the way, in this interwar continuation of the Chassidic crisis, there are other real Mashpi'im, and the first neo-Hasidism. People like Hillel Zeitlin, or even, if we could say, in an extreme example, someone who wasn't even really Orthodox, Martin Buber. That's a neo-Hasidic thought, and to a certain extent, that's beyond the Hasidic movement, on the outside the Hasidic movement looking in. But my favorite examples from the interwar period of real Mashpi'im, kind of like what we're seeing today. The first one I can think of in Hungary, or kind of like Romania actually at that time, is Reb Arel Arot. Reb Arel Arot, who later became the Reb Arelach Hasidim, and today is referred to by his descendants, the Toldos Arain and Toldos Avram Yitzchak. And here is the best illustration how someone starts off as a mashpia, but his descendants already become a formalized, institutionalized Chassidic court with their own institutions, their own customs, and their own politics. But it starts off as a mashpia. Reb Arel Arot is a mashpia in Satmar in the 1920s and 30s, and he moves to Palestine in 1940. And he's mashpia in Yerushalayim. He never really has. He's the Shomrei Emunim. He calls his chabura, his group, his followers, and they're completely. That's exactly a perfect. Reb Arel Arot might be the greatest example of what we see today as today's mashpia. He was like that in the 1920s, 30s, 40s until his untimely passing in 1947. And then what we have is, of course, now it becomes a Chassidic court. A new dynasty is born, and that's what will probably happen with today's mashpias as well. Skelen might fall into this category. Skelen is an interesting scenario. The Skelener Rebbe, he kind of like is a mashpia who eventually evolves into a Rebbe himself. Another interesting one, more on the fringe of the Chassidic movement at this time, is again, this time being in Eastern Europe in the 1920s and 30s, is Rabbi Yehuda Leib Ashlag, the Baal Hasulam, the one who is this Kabbalist, this mystic, a fascinating figure, an interesting figure. He has economic theory, political theory. He's almost like a Marxist, and he writes the most defining commentary on the Zohar, and he has this following. People are into him, and he has this kind of mystical following, which also against when he moves to Israel and through his son and grandson, his descendants, it becomes more formalized into a somewhat of a Chassidic court. It's definitely an interesting one. But he himself was a Belz Chassid who lived in Warsaw and was on the Warsaw Rabbinate for a time. So you're talking about he was part of the mainstream in Polish Chassidus, and he is this mashpia. He becomes this mashpia. There's several other examples as well. Interesting is that we have an interesting phenomena in the post-war rebuilding phase. What happens in the post-war rebuilding phase? We have almost like a mix of both. We have Rebbes, tzaddikim, Chassidic leaders who are from regular formal dynasties with presumably regular formal courts and institutions. But because of the destruction of the Holocaust and this burning need to rebuild, that makes it a new vitality, a very new excitement. We're rebuilding a world that's lost, and they attract new followers from among survivors or from among the general populace in the United States and Israel. And this brings me to another important and overlooked angle of this time, and that is the urbanized nature of the post-war, where we could say with pretty much a certainty that well over 90% of surviving Rebbes in the Chassidic world lived in three places. All three of them, very, very urban. New York City, Tel Aviv, and Yerushalayim. And therefore, since that's the case, we have what I believe is the highest ever proportion in history of Rebbes to general population, of people, Mashpi'im, people who would be interested in going to a Rebbe. Obviously, there was the general Jewish population as well, which was quite significant. But I'm talking about people who would be interested in engaging the services of Rebbes. And therefore, if you were an average Jew living in New York City or Tel Aviv or Yerushalayim in the 1950s and 60s, you had an incredibly high array of Rebbes to go visit and be inspired by, and let them have an impact on your life and follow their teachings and hear their Torah and visit them. And you had incredible accessibility. They were all accessible because no one else was going to them. Many of these Rebbes were looking for a minyan for mincha on a daily basis. So this is a very important and overlooked story, is that you have these Rebbes who ostensibly came from formalized, institutionalized Chassidic dynasties, and yet they're kind of like Mashpi'im in this 1940s and 50s, and to a certain extent the 1960s as well. There's this rebuilding phase. We're going to rebuild a shul and a yeshiva and a court and the institutions, and in Israel it's also politics, right? So there's this Rebbes who are also Mashpi'im during this rebuilding phase, and then from the 1970s and on, we find again cycles. Institutionalization follows the rebuilding in recent years. The institutionalization leads to stagnation on the spiritual side of the Chassidic movement. Of course, the politicization of it does as well. So the recent Mashpi'im phenomenon should be expected at this point. After 40, 50 years of that, it should come as no surprise, because institutionalization and politicization of a movement that is predicated on spiritual principles, it kind of doesn't work, right? So therefore you need this renewal, otherwise something bad can happen to the movement, especially since we're also looking at rapid demographic growth, which is another factor to bear in mind as well. And politics, ever since Orthodox Jewish politics rose in the end of the 19th century and through the 20th, especially in the state of Israel, so politics has a major important factor in the Chassidic movement, but to a certain extent on the spiritual side it's detrimental. So you have this balance, this dialectic balance that balances it out, and that's where people like the Mashpi'im can come in. Also urbanization. That's another factor. And if we bring it back to today, so Mashpi'im are sort of like these mini Baal Shem Tovs. It's a throwback to the early days of the movement, or it's a throwback to those educators in the early 1900s who used education and those types of ironically institutions to bring vitality to an overly institutionalized movement. And time will tell, and with the cyclical view of history, it's safe to say that many of these mashpi'im will spawn dynasties of their own, which will later institutionalize and politicize, and then another generation of mashpi'im will come along in another form, while still teaching the timeless lessons of Chassidus. So this is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.